Welcome to the first episode in our nutrition education series for people living with diabetes. Whether you're just starting out on your diabetes journey or are a seasoned pro who could use a quick refresh, this session offers all the basics when it comes to healthy eating and diabetes. Registered dietitian and certified diabetes educator Pamela Piotrowski will explore healthy choices, the recommended plate model, and the recommended eating pattern to maximize your energy and nourishment, as well as help manage your diabetes. Over to you, Pam.
Hello, my name is Pam, and during today's session, we're going to review why healthy eating is essential to everyone for promoting good health, minimizing injury, and reducing the risk of diseases, and why this is so important for diabetes management itself. We will examine the rationale behind this concept of a balanced plate, how it applies to your individual meal choices, as well as dive a little bit deeper into the importance of key elements that provide energy from the foods that we eat and the role they may play in blood sugar control. And so you aren't confused, I may interchange the words glucose and sugar when I'm referring to what it is that's in your blood, but it's the same thing. So I hope you can keep up. We'll start to crack down on the code of reading labels to help make better choices. It might take you a little bit of time in the beginning to figure out these labels, but once you've got it, you'll be well on your way. And we're going to organize all this information to develop a healthy eating pattern that works for you. Let me start by saying the most important thing. There is no diabetes-specific diet, as diets are hard to follow in the long term, as you may have found out in the past. But what is important is the what somebody eats, the how much they eat, and the when they eat. That's really important when we talk about making better food choices and planning healthy meals for diabetes management. When people learn how these aspects of their eating habits can impact their health, they will be able to make changes, small or large, to improve their blood sugar control and reduce the risk of complications. So let's get going here. Food and nutrition, important elements of diabetes management, as I mentioned. Now, I want you to think of food and nutrition as a type of treatment, no different than medications or physical activity is for people living with diabetes. And throughout this video, we are going to focus on the food and nutritional aspects that are part of your diabetes self-care. Learn how different foods affect your blood sugars, because at different times of our lives, our blood sugars may be affected differently by some of the quantities and the types of foods that we're eating, and what that means to your risk of complications down the road, as well as how small changes can make big differences. While it's natural to have questions about nutrition and what foods to eat, we're going to try to untangle some of that dietary advice that may be on the internet that you've already noticed. Or it may come from well-wishers to help you manage your diabetes that is evidence-based. So be careful of the potential for false promises that may be with fad diets, supplements, special diabetic or dietetic foods. It's always best to talk with your healthcare professional before putting your trust in potential misinformation out there. And this could harm you instead of helping you. I encourage you to go to diabetes.ca, heartandstroke.ca, or unlockfood.ca as reputable sites to go for more information on topics that we will be discussing. And throughout, keep in mind that there is no one diet fits all approach. Finding out what works for you is most important to keeping you healthy. Because eating is something that we need to do on a daily basis, we need to find out that right balance to keep ourselves healthy while still promoting good health and quality of life. Often people think that once they get their A1C to target, that they can go back to their old eating habits. But remember what we said about healthy eating patterns being like a treatment for diabetes. You take away that treatment and the blood sugars will creep back up. So try to find what will work for you in the long run. Small changes can make the difference. And you might find that you're doing all of these things already and it's still not making a difference. It's always best, again, to talk with your diabetes educator to see what other changes might need to be made throughout your diabetes management. So let's move on and try to find what will work for you in the long run. Picking healthy food choices more often will help to provide energy to do daily activities, fuel your muscles, prevent injury, and also help with your mood. All things that are most important for managing diabetes and reducing your risk of diabetes or its complications. But beyond controlling blood sugars, healthy eating can also help you manage weight and, as I said, lower your risk of other complications or other chronic conditions like heart disease that is more prevalent in people that have diabetes. High blood pressure, osteoporosis, arthritis, certain forms of cancer are all linked to what we eat. So here's another good reason for why healthy eating matters. Eating well is good for overall health, and there's many ways to do it. I want you to pick what might work for you. So what are the basics of healthy eating, you might ask, or maybe you already know. Think of it as a shift of food choices that can be done by eating more of certain types of foods, replacing current choices with better options, or limiting your consumption of less desirable foods, as we'll talk about throughout the session. It's key to have a variety of foods, but that doesn't mean that you have to eat all foods to ensure that you're getting all the nutrients like vitamins and minerals that are found in different food groups. Those food groups being fruits and vegetables, meat and protein alternatives, dairy products, and grains and starchy foods. By the way, I'm not a fan of kale, but I try to pick other green leafy vegetables to get similar nutrients. And as always, make sure you're drinking water or low-calorie beverage to keep well hydrated. That is still part of a healthy eating pattern. I know that cost and availability can be challenging to some, and where possible, pick whole foods to avoid excess salt, sugar, preservatives that are usually found in packaged and ultra-processed foods. In some cases, frozen and canned can be just as healthy and may be a better alternative. Preparing meals yourself gives you the advantage of knowing what's going into your meals, how you're preparing them, and how it's making a difference on your diabetes control. But it does involve a little bit of planning ahead of time. I will warn you about that. But once you get the hang of it, you'll be right on your way. So my first question to you is, what do you do? Do you eat to live, or do you live to eat? Some people will say that they know when their body is full, and others may have difficulty with figuring out when to stop and when they're full. Have you ever eaten because you were bored, feeling down, or just because the food was staring at you on the table? Be aware of the different reasons for why you're eating. By all means, if you're feeling hypoglycemic, please eat some sugar. But be mindful of why you're eating what you do, and that can be just as important as what you're eating. Some people may find that a strict routine with their food intake helps manage their blood sugars perfectly, but only you will know if that's something that's sustainable for you. Meaning, can you do it in the long term? Because this is something that you want to do for the long run. It's important to find a way to enjoy what you're eating because it is something we have to do on a daily basis. Please look for ways to prepare meals that work for you, because if you don't enjoy food preparation, or perhaps eating becomes socially undesirable, it can be a very stressful part of your day-to-day routine. Rest assured, the more you become aware of what healthy eating can mean to you and your blood sugar control, and how you can learn how your body reacts to different foods at different times in your life, with different situations, you will find eating can be done in a way that is not considered difficult while still enjoying social aspects and reaping in all the nutritional benefits. If you were to write down what you ate for a week, what would your food or meals look like? Could you make some changes right now with what we've already talked about? We're learning more and more about the importance of good nutrition and healthy food choices for day-to-day wellness and for reducing the risk of injury and chronic disease. But what it means to you, I might say again, I may ask in 5 years and it might be different information. So it's great to keep up to date on this information. Now, look at this plate. It looks amazing, but it also looks a bit confusing. So here's what we're going to talk about with the concept of a balanced plate. It's one of the most important diet habits you can do by picking half of your plate of vegetables. Vegetables are high in nutrients that the body needs to be healthy. And because non-starchy vegetables tend to be higher in fiber and water content, this can help to keep you full longer and control the amounts of other foods that you're putting on your plate. And that may control your blood sugars. The other part of that half a plate can be divided up again so that a quarter is coming from protein foods. And you want to be looking for lean proteins and plant proteins as well as fish to be part of that quarter of your plate. Try to eat at least 2 servings of fish each week, and maybe try different recipes that include plant-based things like tofu or legumes, nuts, and seeds as great sources of protein as well. And last but not least, fill that remaining quarter of your plate with your carbohydrates, or what's commonly known as grains or starchy vegetables. Picking whole grains and crackers, brown or wild rice, quinoa, oatmeal, barley, potatoes with their skins on, are all going to be ways to fill that quarter of the plate while keeping you full. Now, think about it. Was the plate at your last meal, did it look like this? Was it balanced the same way? Perhaps there's a little bit more that you can add to that half of vegetables and a little less to the pasta that you may have consumed last night. Eating foods in moderation will allow you to get the energy that your body needs, as well as including enough fiber, enough energy, enough protein that all makes a healthy diet. Or, as I say, a healthy meal pattern. A couple of tips that I might add to this is looking for bright, vibrant colored vegetables. So look for the oranges, the greens, the reds in your vegetables. If you can, leave the skins on for extra fiber. Prepare your foods in a healthy way, baking, broiling, steaming, poaching, stir frying. But you might say, wow, a plate with a piece of plain chicken, a baked potato, and some steamed broccoli and carrots just doesn't sound appealing. So here's where you want to take some of your favorite recipes or the meals that you already consume and modify them a bit so that this balance holds true. Perhaps it's adding more vegetables to your meal. Perhaps it's pureeing some vegetables and making them into a sauce for your potatoes. Maybe it's adding a salad before your meal so that we still have that balance of a half coming from vegetables, a quarter coming from protein, and a quarter coming from carbohydrates. Even if you have a recipe, think of the ingredients that you're consuming and how you might rearrange the quantities of the foods in there so that you have this balance. Be careful though, if you consume too many of the refined grains like bread, pasta, minute rice, these may cause spikes in your blood glucose, even if you are consuming only a quarter of your plate of them. So be careful. As you will notice, this plate doesn't have any dairy products on it. It doesn't have dessert on it. So even a glass of milk and a piece of fruit after your meal could be healthy alternatives. But be careful, limit the sugars and sweets for desserts that we sometimes have, like cookies and ice cream, cakes, and pie. If you are going to consume a small quantity of that, try to work it back into that balanced plate. Perhaps you eat a little less of the pasta or the potato if you know you're going to have some cookies. Perhaps you have less fruit if you're going to be having some pie or an apple crisp, so that you can still balance all the nutrients that your body requires. And remember, we're trying to do these things in moderation, so it's not a complete turnaround from today to tomorrow's meals. Another thing I want you to be cautious about is high fat and greasy foods, okay? They won't necessarily affect your blood sugar now, but they may affect your digestion. They may also impact your weight going further, and that may impact your diabetes management in the long term. So be careful with fried potatoes, creamy sauces, battered or breaded foods. And of course, that hydration factor is so important. It could be some low-fat milk. It could be having water, unsweetened tea or coffee. Plain broths could be a great addition to your meals. But be cautious with regular pop. Even fruit juice or sweetened tea can raise your blood sugar and cause problems down for you. Now let's take a look at those sources of energy that I mentioned coming from the balanced plate. I made a comment about carbohydrates or grains and starchy foods. So did you know that carbohydrates are the body's preferred source of energy? The sugar that comes from all sources of carbohydrates is otherwise known as glucose when it enters into the bloodstream. And that's why we have such an emphasis on carbohydrates when we talk about why we need to be careful with the quantity of the foods containing and how they impact our diabetes management. Converting carbs into immediate usable energy is easier for the body than using fat or protein as an energy source. Did you know that? Your brain, muscles, cells all need carbohydrates to function, which is why a very low carb diet is not really healthy at all. Depending on the type of carbohydrates that you're consuming, the food is converted into sugar or glucose at varying rates. As it enters the bloodstream after being digested and metabolized, it's either transported into the body through insulin to the cells, or it's used later as a storage of energy. If there's not enough insulin from within your body, or you're not taking the right or enough of diabetes medications to help with that transport, the glucose is left circulating in the bloodstream. And this is where the complications of diabetes come into effect. When your blood sugar levels are above target for too long and cause damage to the vessels leading to other parts of your body. The dietary reference intake for Canadians suggests a minimum of 130 grams of carbohydrates per day, or 45 to 60% of the total calorie intake coming from carbohydrates. But what does that mean specifically for you? Well, the easiest way in today's session is to have you refer back to that balanced plate, looking at a quarter of what you're eating coming from the starches or the grains that you're consuming. Now, if you're working with a dietitian or a diabetes educator, they can help you go into more detail with carb counting and what the actual number might mean for you throughout your meals and daily intake. Although being aware of how much carbohydrate you're consuming is key, equally important is the quality of that carbohydrate, not just the quantity. Now, I probably don't need to tell you where carbs are found, but as a refresher, you'll find them most abundantly in grains, starchy vegetables, fruit, milk, and of course, various forms of sugars and sweets. But the healthiest sources are going to come from unprocessed or minimally processed foods. Not only will you naturally get the most vitamins and minerals, but they're probably going to be higher in fiber and more likely to have something called a lower glycemic index that we're going to talk about in a bit. These are also referred to as complex carbs. And your intake of carbs should consist mostly of these sources. Now, you can still eat other types of carbs, and less optimal sources would be things like white processed bread, fruit juices, desserts, or other highly refined or processed foods. You know, honey, maple syrup, molasses all seem to have really healthy benefits and may seem like healthier versions to sweeteners, but really from a diabetes perspective, they're no different than just eating straight table sugar and using it only if you're having a hypoglycemic reaction. Also known as simple carbs, these things are easily digested and quickly brought to your bloodstream. So that's something to be aware of, because if you're not taking enough medication or your insulin is not working the same way as someone without diabetes, this could cause problems with your blood sugar staying at target. But it also could interfere with weight management, increase risk of heart disease, and fatty liver. Many people are confused about carbohydrates. Maybe you are right now. But keep in mind that if you're just starting out, it's important to eat a moderate amount of carbs and then try to pick the healthier sources than to follow a strict diet or totally removing them from your eating habits right now. Remember, small changes can produce big differences in your diabetes management. As I previously mentioned, protein is an important part of healthy eating for many reasons, including growth and repair of body tissues such as muscle, bone, skin, hair, and virtually every other part of your body. And like carbohydrates, protein provide energy, but it's not the body's preferred source of fuel. From a diabetes perspective, it's an important part of a meal to help regulate how quickly a meal is digested, thus keeping you full longer and helping to reduce those spikes in blood sugars after eating. Including more plant-based proteins and fish is also beneficial, as I mentioned before, from both a diabetes and a heart health perspective. The best picks from this food group would be leaner cuts of meat, those with less marbling, more fatty fishes, low-fat dairy products, eggs, plant-based choices like soy, tofu, nuts, seeds, legumes. Now, you can find small amounts of protein in grains and some vegetables, but I don't consider them one of your better choices. Be careful with how those protein foods are prepared, as some may be prepared with extra sodium from sauces or extra carbs from batter or breading. And watch out for the skin on poultry or that marbling in your meat, because those can contribute to unhealthy fats that we'll talk about in a minute. So what about fat? We used to think fat was really bad for us. Now we know a little bit different. That fat is the most calorie-dense food that we eat, and we do need some of it. Not only is it a source of energy for our body, but it assists with the growth and development of cells and helps the body absorb certain essential fatty acids or fat-soluble vitamins. The problem is with fats is that they're not all created equal. The key to understanding the health aspect of fats is considering the total amount and knowing what type of fat it is. Saturated or trans fats, you may have heard, okay, are also referred to as the bad fats in the diet, and they're primarily found in animal sources, including whole fat dairy products. Coconut and palm oil are the only two plant sources that I know of that are saturated fats in the diet, and you want to be careful with them. They may have other health benefits, but from a cardiovascular perspective, they can clog your arteries and contribute to your cholesterol levels. Unsaturated fats, that would be monounsaturated, polyunsaturated, aka the good fats in our diet, are mostly found in things like nuts and seeds, avocados, soybeans, as well as all of their oils and those fatty fishes that I had referred to. An easy way to remember the difference between the good and the bad fats in your diet is that the healthier ones, the unsaturated ones, are liquid at room temperature, as in this picture here. And the unhealthy fats are usually solid, and you wouldn't want to have solid fat clogging up your blood vessels. The main health issue with those saturated fats is its effect on cholesterol levels or the risk of heart disease, which is also a significant risk for people living with diabetes. So be careful with the quantities and look to see where they're found in your diet. You may not be able to remove all of the saturated fats in your diet, but cutting back is definitely a healthy way to go about the heart healthy aspect of your diet. But regardless of the types of fat, as I mentioned, the total fat content is something you also want to be aware of, as this is something that can contribute to central adiposity, or that weight that's carried around your middle section, which is linked to insulin resistance and diabetes management. Oh, fiber, my friend. It's a non-digestible carbohydrate source naturally found in plant foods. It's found in things like the berries here, other fruit, veggies, nuts, seeds, legumes, whole grains, as well as made into fiber supplements. But the more a food is processed or refined, the less natural occurring fiber is left in it, unless it's added back during the processing or the manufacturing. The good news about fiber is that the body is unable to break down and absorb this type of carbohydrate. It doesn't cause a spike in blood sugars the way other carbohydrates can, and in fact, can actually help reduce the spikes in your blood sugars. Now, to be clear, there are two types of fiber, soluble and insoluble. Each one has important health benefits and plays a different role in the body. Soluble fiber dissolves in water, forms a gel-like substance in your stomach. That slows down digestion, attaches to fatty acids to help remove them out of the body, and in doing so can help control your blood sugar and cholesterol levels. Some good sources of soluble fiber that come to my mind are apples, bananas, oats, peas, black beans, lima beans, Brussels sprouts, avocados. There's so many different sources of soluble fiber, and you can find those lists on some of those websites that I've referred to previously. Now, insoluble fiber, equally as important, but doesn't dissolve in water. So if you were to compare two different soluble and insoluble, you would find that the insoluble fiber that comes usually in whole grains, the skins and the seeds and everything, just sits at the bottom of your water glass there. But it's so important because it actually is not broken down, passes through your intestine, and is a great way to remove some of the waste that collects in our intestines. While all fiber is good for you, my only word of caution is to be careful on how you increase the amount of your daily intake. Make sure you do it gradually, and make sure that you're drinking adequate fluids and moving around. Otherwise, you may run into some distressing bloating or gas or other gastrointestinal side effects. As we learn more and more about its role in the health of our gut, immunity, and anti-inflammatory properties, this also holds true for how it manages your diabetes. Now, I referred to something called the glycemic index a while back. And what is this glycemic index? It's a scale that ranks a carbohydrate containing food or drink by how much it raises blood glucose levels after it was consumed. So as you can see on this chart here, this graph, foods with a high glycemic index rise blood sugars really quickly and faster than foods with a lower glycemic index. As we know it also as the GI index, it assigns a number to a food based on how drastically it makes your sugar rise and then come back down. You will see after 2 hours, your sugars are at the same level, but it's what happens in between during that 2-hour period that can also have an impact on diabetes management and complications. Now, these foods are ranked on a scale of 0 to 100, with pure glucose or table sugar given a value of 100. The lower a food's glycemic index, the slower the blood glucose rises after eating that food, and that's a very good thing, as seen in the yellow graph here. Generally speaking, the more processed a food is, the carbohydrate a food is, the higher its glycemic index is. Take, for example, a slice of French baguette bread. Its glycemic index is 95. So eating the same amount of grams of carbohydrate of white bread, when you compare it to something that has more fiber or fat in it, I'm thinking maybe a half a cup of cooked barley that has a lower glycemic index, one of something like 22, you can see how they may impact your blood sugars at 1 hour out or at a half an hour out if you were checking your blood sugars after your meals. To simplify things, there's a chart on the diabetes.ca website that shows low, medium, and high glycemic index foods. I don't want you to get caught up on the exact numbers, but to try and collectively put them in as they have them. Green categories for low glycemic index food, medium ones, and then the high ones that we should try to eat a minimal amount of. Keep in mind that if you have protein foods or sources of fat or fiber in the foods that you're consuming or can add them to your meal, that can lower the glycemic index of the total meal, which might have the same benefit than picking just low glycemic index foods. How can this help you make better choices? Well, choosing lower glycemic index more often than high glycemic index foods will not only help you with real-time control of your blood sugars, as I mentioned if you were checking them, but it'll help you keep full longer, promote weight management, and also help lower the risk of some of those diabetes complications including the risk of heart disease and stroke. And as I mentioned, even if you can't remove all the high glycemic index foods from your diet, try just lowering the glycemic index of the meal by adding a source of protein, even if it's a glass of milk or some nuts to your grains. Leave the skins on your potatoes. Have fruits and vegetables where possible, so that you can add extra fiber to your meal. And another thing that people weren't aware of is to cook pasta and rice undercooked a bit. Al dente, you might be familiar with that term, because the more something is processed, the higher the glycemic index. So if we can undercook something, not meaning you eat it raw, but that's also going to lower the glycemic index as your body takes it in. But remember, just because a carbohydrate-containing food has a low glycemic index attached to it, you still need to be careful with how much you're consuming total, because the total grams of carbs, whether it's a low or a high glycemic index food, will still impact your blood sugar control. So one of the things that most people have problems or tell me that they're confused about is reading food labels. And just as I mentioned previously about picking less processed foods, it doesn't mean that you can't eat foods that have a label on them. But the key is being able to understand what you're looking for. So let's try to break this down into 3 little easy steps. So a label can help determine if it is a good choice or whether you should think twice about something when you're picking it up on the shelf. When you know what things you're looking for, this is a great way to be able to compare different foods. Maybe there's a better option that you didn't realize in the same category of foods. Most foods packaged in Canada have to have a nutrition facts table, like the one you see here on the slide. Notice the first red box. That's probably most important, because that's the serving size that all the rest of the information in this nutrition facts table is based on. So if you see this, it's 107 calories for this serving, but only if you're eating this serving of 12 crackers. So you need to determine, is this the serving size that I'm eating, or is it another amount that is my portion? And be able to adjust the numbers based on that. Specifically, though, when you're looking at from a diabetes and a blood sugar management perspective, you'll see in bold that we have those micro or macronutrients we were talking about before: fat, carbohydrate, and protein. And they're bolded. Underneath and indented below each of that bolding listed is subcomponents of those foods. Remember, I referred to saturated fats before as an unhealthy part of the total fat intake. And for carbohydrates specifically from a diabetes perspective, you'll see that the total amount of carbohydrates in these 12 crackers is 27 grams. But this can be confusing, because when you indent, you see that fiber is a component of it. Sugars might be a component of it from what is added in the preparation of these crackers. You might see sugar alcohols. You might see starch. All of these subcomponents that are indented add up to the total amount of carbohydrate. So if you're trying to determine how many grams of carbs you're actually consuming from this label, the number would be 27. But wait, because fiber is that carbohydrate food that your body can't digest, it means you get to subtract the fiber content from that total carbohydrate. So really, there's 26 grams of carbohydrates in this. So this makes it a little bit easier to see that a food that contains a lot of fiber may have a lot more carbohydrates, but really you subtract that amount of fiber from the total carbohydrate, and that's how you would determine how many grams of carbs your body is actually getting and turning into sugar in your body. Now, one of the things that a lot of people will do is that they will count their carbs and be able to swap things out, meaning that there's 12 crackers for 27 grams of carbs. And if you know that a slice of sandwich bread is 15 grams of carbs, or half a cup of cooked pasta is 15 grams of carbs, you could say, do I want some soup broth with 12 crackers, or would I like to have 2 slices of sandwich bread? Or do I want 6 crackers and 1 slice of sandwich bread to get 30 grams of carbs, let's say, if that's what I'm consuming at my meal? This is where it can get confusing, but you know what? I think we're going to have more discussion on this in another session. And as well, when it talks about fat and protein, I'm going to leave that to another session on label reading. Now, that second box, probably another confusing thing to you. What is percent daily value, or DV? The percent DV is meant to act as a benchmark to determine if a food is high or low in a certain nutrient, compared to what the daily recommended intake value is for Canadians. Now, this is an average. It's based on an average eating of 2,000 calories per adult. But what does this mean specifically to you? Well, a food is considered low in a specific nutrient if there's less than 5% DV. So take a look on that side panel there of the label and look to see if any of these foods are less than 5%. And they would mean that that's a low intake of that. So there's really not very much fiber in this food product. But sodium, on the other hand, has 16%. And we will say that a food is considered high in a nutrient if it has more than 15% of daily value. In the case of sodium, of course, maybe this is something you want to be aware of and eat less of because you're also watching your blood pressure, or you've eaten other high salty foods that day. So this is how you can compare 2 labels of crackers and pick which one might be the more desirable choice. And last but not least, the third box that I want to draw your attention to is the ingredient list of things. Okay. And that tells us what ingredients are found in a food, which can help us if we have allergies, food intolerances, or we don't like a certain ingredient in a food. Now, what you need to be careful, though, is my rule of thumb is to say, look at the first 3 ingredients. If the first 3 ingredients have a starch, a flour, sugar, or anything that ends with OSE, dextrose, glucose, fructose, maltose, those are all sources of carbohydrates, and you need to be careful. And if it's in the top 3 ingredients, it's likely a higher proportion in that food product there. So you can be careful watching what you're consuming and what's being put into those foods. Now, I haven't written it down here. It's not on the slide. But lastly, I think it's really important to take a look at health claims on labels. Just because a food has a health claim doesn't mean that it's a food that's good for you. For example, there's some kinds of candies out there that promote fat-free, but we know that there's a lot of sugar in them. And there's other things that say no added sugar or dietetic food, but they still may have a lot of carbohydrates in them, even if they aren't sugar that's in it. Or if it's dietetic, what does that mean? What do these terms mean? So you want to be careful when you're looking at a label and do a little more sleuthing. Now, just because you're trying to change your eating habits to help you with diabetes does not mean you can't eat out. Okay. It can be a significant part of business dinners, can be a nice social gathering, or a convenient option when you don't have the time to cook. And with a bit of planning, you can make nutritious choices the next time you eat out, and your blood sugars will appreciate it. Now, keep in mind, many restaurants actually have a menu and their nutrition information listed online. So if you have the time, take a look at that menu before you actually go to the restaurant. Sometimes by the time we're at the restaurant or the time we're at the takeout line there, we're looking at the most desirable food, and perhaps our appetite is on high alert there. We may not be picking the best choices. So if you can decide ahead of time, that may help make better options for you. Keep that balanced plate in mind. Ask for a salad as an appetizer instead of the garlic bread that's put in front of you. Pick 2 veggie options instead of potatoes with your steak. Have the smaller steak, not the larger one. Or if you want to have a small piece of pie after, maybe you don't have as much of the starch with your meal and the breaded cheese sticks to start off with. Watch the portion sizes. As I mentioned about the steak and the large amount there, portion sizes in fast food restaurants and restaurants tend to be typically much larger than at home, leading us to eat more because, wow, we paid for it. It tastes good. Why wouldn't we? Listen to your body and try to stop before you are full. Ask for a takeout container. Leave it aside. Put your napkin on it. You want to be careful because those extra portions, if done on the rare occasion, may not be a problem. But if eating out is something you do on a regular basis, could be the difference between you managing your blood sugars optimally or not. Some of the things that I like to suggest to people is ask for half portions. Share an entree, share an appetizer. As I mentioned, package it up to go so that you're not stuck with the food in front of you and just eating because it's there, not because you're hungry. Ask how food is prepared. Maybe you prepare your chicken a certain way, but the way they do it in the restaurant might have added salts or sauces and things like that. Order foods that have been steamed, baked, broiled, grilled, roasted, similar to how I was mentioning how you would do it at home. Don't forget about the breading or the batters that can come on foods, the sauces, the dressings. They all add some of those extras that you may not be putting on your foods at home. Yes, it may taste ultra good, but it may have a bad effect on your overall health. I also caution about the sweetened drinks or alcohol drinks that might be served when you're eating out at a restaurant. If you do drink alcohol, limit it to when you're eating a meal, as it can affect your blood sugar levels and interact with some of the medications you take. And talking about medications and the timing of your eating, be careful about this. The more you deviate from consistency in your medication times that you take, meds, or the times that you eat, the more it can have an impact on your blood sugars and your diabetes management. Bottom line, healthy eating takes a bit of planning when you're going out, but once you do it, you can do it without compromising your diabetes management and enjoy eating out with friends, family, or if it's for business. Now we're getting towards the end of things here, and I'm trying to sum things up here and see if I can help you to find out what is right for you. But healthy eating patterns and healthy eating habits cannot be easily defined as just one thing because it's different for every person. As I mentioned before, there's no one diet fits all. To some, healthy eating may mean eating more variety of foods, and that's the change that you make. And to others, it might mean trying to eat out less or less takeout foods. Your healthy eating pattern must take into consider the factors like health conditions, culture and religious reasons, food aversions, socioeconomic status, any factors that are important to you. Okay. And working with a diabetes educator or you yourself can look at all these factors to see how they can help you or how they may become a barrier to planning a healthy meal pattern for diabetes management. But it can be done. Now, some of the healthy eating patterns that I know that I've seen out there that work for people would be following a Mediterranean style diet, a Nordic style eating pattern, the DASH diet you may have heard of, vegetarian style diet. Now, these are all dietary patterns that work very well with diabetes friendly food choices. They're rich in protective foods. As I mentioned, from a cardiovascular perspective, they might have lots of antioxidants. They could be high in fiber. They may be low in processed foods. But these are all things that you want to take a look at when you're planning what your healthy eating pattern is. So let's try these things on for size. Can you eat 3 meals a day and snacks as needed? Okay. Try to eat something within 2 hours of waking and avoid going more than 6 hours between waking hours between meals and snacks. Consistency of meal timing will also help you get a better understanding of what your blood sugars are doing. Don't forget to eat a variety of foods to get the right amount of protein and fiber in your diet, because this too will help with your blood glucose levels. Remember that plate concept for planning meals? Try to balance it with 3 or 4 of the food groups that we initially talked about at meal times, and as needed, with a source of protein with another food group if you need a snack, if there's been long periods of time without eating, or perhaps you're doing extra physical activity more than usual. This balance will help you to get the fuel that your body needs while avoiding the spikes in blood sugar levels. Switching to lower glycemic foods, that might be your healthy eating pattern change that you're going to make, and finding ways to do it that are enjoyable. Sip on water or other low-calorie fluids throughout the day to stay hydrated. Watch out for your caffeine and alcohol intake. Dipping energy levels can be a result of not getting enough fluids, and getting the right fluids will leave your body and mind feeling much better. And if you don't have those fluids, that can leave you feeling mentally and physically exhausted and putting you at risk for overeating or making inappropriate choices. Cutting back on ultra-processed foods, you know, those packaged foods that I was referring to before, can be also a way to help develop a healthy eating pattern. Now, I'm going to say, I love this slide here of a puzzle pieces. And I don't know if any of you use puzzles, but you might be feeling quite puzzled right now by all this information that I've shared with you. But I assure you, once you start fitting all these pieces together, you will see the bigger picture. If it's not just through this session, but other sessions that you will be watching. Improved eating habits, feeling more in control of the things that you do have control over, are just one step closer to you having better diabetes management. I'll hope you come to realize that you don't have to have all the pieces to the puzzle here to know what the bigger picture looks like. It's not an all or nothing, but fitting in some of the little pieces bit by bit as you go along your journey. I will finish with leaving you with this 80-20 rule. When it comes to eating, if you can follow the guidelines 80% of the time, you will be in a very good position to having a better understanding of how your body and your blood sugars respond to your eating habits. This will allow you that flexibility 20% of the time to find out what works best for you and continue to make modifications. I thank you for participating in today's session. I wish you good health, and I hope you found a couple of key takeaways that you can start working on in the days to follow.